One thing, Ian, that I think is interesting because you talk about risk. One of the biggest risks from the last election, since we're talking about the election cycle, was, of course, the influence of Russia, misinformation. How is that playing out right now? Are you seeing the signals that we're going to have a repeat, or do you think we've addressed those risks?
I don't think that one of the biggest risks in the 2020 or 2016 elections was external influence from the Russians. I mean, I agree that they put some money into it, in the single millions of dollars, to the best of our knowledge, and they developed some Facebook groups which were divisive and helped to drive some violence. I mean, one of the largest Black Lives Matter groups on Facebook, with some hundreds of thousands of followers, was completely a Russian cutout organization. I mean, my God, driving racism in the United States, that is, those people should all be in jail. There's no question. And of course, there's no extradition coming for those folks. But overwhelmingly, the problems of U.S. legitimacy are homegrown. They are a problem of technology and algorithms. They're problems of the media model and the social media model. And they will be problems of AI in very short order, and deep fakes and disinformation. They're problems of identity politics and inequality, and they're problems of political opportunism and those that are acting in performative fashion to take advantage of all of that polarization in the United States. And we're exporting it. We're exporting it to Brazil. We're exporting it to Europe. We're exporting it to Canada. Not intentionally, but again, it's what the model does. So yes, of course, I'm worried that in 2024, where we have two political candidates likely running against each other who are both very unpopular, who are both very old, one of whom, in my view, is completely unfit for any office, Donald Trump. And I felt that way when he was a Democrat. It has nothing to do with his political affiliation. And the level of disinformation. I mean, we just saw today that former Mayor Giuliani, senior advisor to Trump, admitted that he was lying about Georgia election results. But that's not going to change the view of any Trump supporters. As Trump has said, he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't lose any of his voters, unless the one he shot was one of his voters. Then he'd be down one voter. But that's it. I think that we need to be very deeply concerned about what that means for 2024, irrespective of what the outcome is. Because I think that no matter who wins in 2024, the supporters of the loser will believe that the outcome is illegitimate. And some of them will take up violence. And the disinformation that comes from that, the damage of civil society that comes from that, I think is increasingly significant, structural, and lasting.
Well, it's interesting. This is not a unique problem to the U.S. As you mentioned, we've had news this week in Israel with the Supreme Court, the curbs on the Supreme Court's power. How important is that as an issue? Because some people understand the importance of the relationship with Israel, but it does feel distant from what the U.S. is dealing with. How are you seeing it?
Well, of course, it's a tiny democracy. I mean, it's like less than 10 million people, but it's also the most entrenched democracy in the Middle East. It's also the most steadfast ally of the United States in terms of intelligence coordination, military support, technology exchange, you name it. And it is true that Bibi Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government has worked very hard to undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary. Now, the response of the people in Israel, of the majority of the people, has been widespread demonstrations for many, many months now. They've been incredibly civil and peaceful. They have not led to violence. They have not led to destruction of property, despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of Israelis, which, I mean, given the size of the country, is the equivalent of tens of millions of Americans on the streets every weekend. So it's really quite inspiring. And it has forced Netanyahu to suspend and then water down the reforms of the judiciary that are being pushed forward. And the reforms that have just been passed are only one small piece of what he originally wanted. And they involve the suspension of the unreasonable clause for the Supreme Court, which means that the Supreme Court can no longer strike down a piece of legislation because they find it unreasonable in the context of Israeli politics, which is different from finding it illegal. In other words, this is a component of the Israeli judiciary that is considerably stronger than the American Supreme Court, for example. And many in Israel believe that that is too strong and needs to be redressed. And the Supreme Court itself is going to rule on this piece of legislation. And we'll see what happens, because, of course, if they rule against it, it's conceivable you could have a constitutional crisis. Then there's also the inability for the Supreme Court to strike down appointed members of a cabinet of the Israeli prime minister, which is very important for Netanyahu, because if he can put in his own attorney general, that would allow him to end some of the corruption cases that have been pushed forward against him. No surprise, that's something he's very interested in doing. Now, assuming that these pieces of legislation stand up, that is not the end of Israeli democracy, not at all. It is a change in the balance. It is a strengthening of Netanyahu in the context of a multi-party democracy that has very frequent, very weak coalition governments. So if that was all that happened going forward, I mean, you might downgrade Israel from an investment perspective, because all of this demonstration is making it harder to invest there. It's causing disruption, but you wouldn't say Israel's becoming a non-democracy. Now, Netanyahu and his ministers have also said this is just the first step. They intend to continue with these reforms in the fall. The next piece would be to allow the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, to overturn any Supreme Court ruling with a majority vote. Now, if that
starts
happens,
to get past a boundary, definitely. Yeah.
I think that if that happens, you are suddenly in an environment where the executive really has managed to transgress a checks and balances inside the Israeli democratic system. That to me would change the nature of the democracy. It is very clear that there will be a lot of fighting politically and on the streets before we get to that point. But I mean, if you've been worried about Israel, your alert level has definitely gone up on the back of what's happened in the past several days.